Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now to the papers, and for political nuts, this is a glorious morning. Lots of Jeremy Corbyn interviews and stories inside the papers, but on the front pages, there's the Sunday Times, basically cabinet war. This is about immediately after the election. It says that Philip Hammond, the Chancellor, texted Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary, to say he would support him, not Theresa May, as leader of the Conservative Party. And it's also 4 cabinet ministers apparently were involved in that plot. And then bringing that up to date, there's the Mail on Sunday. Chancellor versus Boris. It's war, all-out war. And if you wonder where these stories are coming from, look to the Sunday Express. Boris, I saved Brexit. As we will hear later on, David Davis disagrees with him. And then finally, the Sunday Telegraph, Boris sets red lines. This is his new demands on Brexit, and there's much more of that inside the papers. It's a little bit like grandmother's footsteps with live ammunition. Isabel, let's start with you.
Well, we're obviously at Labour conference, and there's a push from pro-single market Labour MPs for more concessions from their leadership on single market membership after the transition period. So Labour had sort of moved on the single market over the past few months, with Keir Starmer saying that actually...
He's been nudging things in that direction for quite some time.
Absolutely, but there are a number of MPs who aren't happy with that yet, and they actually want Labour to make the case for the principle of free movement of people, which I think most people in politics thought had been ruled out by the referendum itself.
This is really interesting because Jeremy Corbyn, every time I've interviewed him before, has been very clear. You cannot be inside the single market without being inside the EU. We are leaving the EU, that's clear. Therefore, we can't be inside the single market, and therefore those 50 Labour MPs are bound to be disappointed.
And it's very difficult because there are so many different strands of opinion on freedom of movement and on the single market within the Labour Party. Obviously, Labour MPs are representing constituencies which voted Leave or Remain. It's not as though Labour voters all reached one decision in the referendum. But Labour MPs in the north are keen to make the case for freedom of movement, while colleagues in neighbouring constituencies think that that would be the electoral death knell for Labour. So it is very difficult for the party to work out what stance it should take.
And yet they keep criticising Theresa May for not being clear enough. The time is now coming, if this is all true about Jeremy Corbyn being on the verge of winning power eventually, he has to make up his mind in clear terms exactly what kind of Britain he wants post-Brexit, exactly what the relationship's going to be, doesn't he, Rachel?
I mean, yes and no. I mean, personally, yes, I would like more clarity, both from the government and the opposition. We all want to know what's going on because uncertainty is a nightmare for us as individuals, for companies, for businesses, for the nation. Uncertainty is a really bad thing, but I think that Labour's holding position on Brexit during the election might actually see it through in this sort of post-election period where the government is obviously chaotic and in a shambles over Brexit. And the opposition's job is to highlight that and hold it to account. And I think that it is doing that, and I think that we've seen that it's doing that with the fact that the government has changed its mind on the transition arrangement, which is entirely a Labour Party policy.
And there are 2 very important interviews with Jeremy Corbyn in today's papers. The first, I think, in the Mirror there.
Yeah, we have this big interview with Jeremy Corbyn in the Mirror today, saying that he relishes taking on the Tories, really just explaining how, you know, these 2 years of the challenges that he's faced as leader have actually sort of strengthened his hand and put him in a much more powerful position, not just because he's proved the wisdom of the Labour Party tacking left in policy terms and in terms of wanting to democratise the party, but also because that learning curve has given him the strength in his own leadership and comfort in his own leadership. And we can see that in the rallies we saw last night in his arrival. It's a complete transformation.
It's a huge rally, and we're here in Brighton, as we very often are for party conferences, but there seem to be more people here than ever before, and a different spirit here, a real thing. And in his interview in The Observer, Jeremy Corbyn has promised this is going to be a different kind of Labour conference. He's actually going to listen to the delegates, and what they say will go.
Well, I think this is the big thing about the left leadership of the Labour Party now. It's not just the politics, which are about wealth redistribution. It's about democratizing the party. It's about using the 500,000 strong membership, bringing inclusion, making people a part of politics, making politics a part of society. And that is something that's very much what the Corbyn leadership wants to do.
Is there an aspect of this which is a kind of fantasy parallel universe, Isabel Harden? Because after all, the government is a Conservative government. The Prime Minister has just laid out her ideas on Brexit, and there's lots of sniping in the papers, which we'll come on to. But nobody has actually fallen out of the government. They are just about holding together, and they can carry on for years to come.
Well, they could carry on for years to come. They could limp on for years to come, but they could also end up destroying themselves as a party by endlessly bickering and refusing to agree on really key issues. I think the other side to the prominence of the Labour membership at this conference is actually the sidelining of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and that's sort of fair enough because actually they were very anti-Corbyn. They predicted the decimation of the Labour Party in the snap election, and they were wrong.
Bruised and lonely-looking Labour MPs limping around on the outskirts of Brighton.
Playing tiny violins.
Playing tiny violins. Let's talk a little bit about the Tory stories which dominate the front pages. Basically, there are two parallel stories, aren't there? The first one comes from Tim Shipman's book, which is written. He's the political editor of the Sunday Times, and he's written a book about the year after the election. And in it, correct me if I'm wrong, what he's basically saying is that Philip Hammond, in the immediate aftermath of the election, texted Boris Johnson to say he would support him as party leader, David Davis would do Brexit, Philip Hammond would do the economy, Boris would be the front man, and Theresa May would be nowhere to be seen.
Yeah, so this is, he's started the serialisation of his new book in the Sunday Times, and if it's anything as good as his last book on Brexit, it's going to be a fantastic read. And these extracts are so fascinating. There's a line about Boris Johnson receiving text messages in the middle of the night as the snap election result came through, and one of them prompted him to turn to his colleagues and friends and say, Philip, meaning Philip Hammond, has just texted me. He's 100% behind me if I go for it. Now, obviously, this was a few months ago. Things have changed quite a lot in terms of relationships between the two of them.
It's history,
Yep.
but it's not history, is it, Rachel? Because you pick up other papers this morning and you now see Philip Hammond and Boris Johnson, then the unlikely allies, now at war with each other. And I'm flipping fed up with Boris.
I'm not sure if yeah.
Or something like that.
Something along those lines,
Says
yes.
the Mail on Sunday.
I mean, it's very strange, isn't it? Because Boris, after, you know, his 4,000-word essay of last week, you know, and then he quietened down and said, of course, Theresa May is in charge, and she said, I'm driving this car, and he just can't keep himself out of the story, can he? He cannot stop these incessant leadership bids that he's making
and
through
somebody
the
pretty
papers.
close to him has been briefing the papers, as you see from the front page of the Sunday Express. And basically what he is claiming is that the speech that Theresa May gave in Florence was more or less dictated by the demands he made, and he's making more demands on the front page of the Sunday Telegraph about what happens during the transition and afterwards.
Yes, I mean, having said she's in charge, he's now saying, well, actually, I did it. He's taking the credit for reducing the transition period from 5 years to 2 years, and he now also wants to change the terms of the transition period, which is a bit ridiculous, really, because you can't change the rules of Britain's relationship with the EU once for the transition and again after the transition period. So it doesn't really make much practical sense.
Can I ask a political question, Isabel? We've been, everyone's been knocking Boris Johnson around the shop for weeks now, but is it possible this very, very bold play is actually going to work for him?
Well, he is definitely tapping into a big conflict in the Cabinet over what Britain's long-term relationship with the European Union is going to look like after the transition period, which is something that May really didn't answer in her Florence speech. And because there's so much angst about this in the wider party, particularly amongst the European research group of Tory MPs who want a clean Brexit, he has got a lot of people behind him. And even though he is making a bolder play than many politicians would think safe, actually he's doing it with a Prime Minister who still doesn't have that much authority to keep giving ministers a scolding every time they step out of line. She has very limited political capital.
And sometime the Tories are going to scratch their heads and think, have we got anybody who's got a chance of taking on Jeremy Corbyn? Maybe Boris is the man.
Yeah.
A lot of them will think that way. Now let's move on to a more serious story, I have to say, Rachel Shabby, which is, we talk about war of words. We're getting very close to a real war, I think, in North Korea.
We are.
Donald Trump has God save us all, been tweeting again overnight?
Donald Trump has been tweeting he heard the foreign minister of North Korea speak at the UN yesterday, and his response to it was basically to threaten millions of citizens of North Korea, which, you know, it looks like the sort of pantomime villain story, doesn't it, on both sides? But actually it is really, really serious, and it is very threatening
the words
to the lives.
Totally chilling, aren't they? We're beginning to run out of time. Isabel, I'm going to give you a choice. Would you like to do the Uber story or the mental health story?
I'd love to do the Prince Harry story.
Prince Harry story.
Yeah.
Let's go to that then.
So
Tell us about that.
Prince Harry attacking Britain's pill-popping culture, saying that actually there has to be a better way of solving mental health problems than just giving out antidepressants, which is totally right, because antidepressants really are only the sort of plaster cast that help you heal as you get better.
You've been struggling yourself with depression,
Absolutely,
I think,
yeah.
haven't you?
I've basically come back from on and off a year of sick leave with mental health problems, and I have to say it was antidepressants, once my doctor had doubled my dose of them, that got me back into work. But beyond that, there was counselling, there was a huge amount of running that I've had to do.
Nature, running, walks, all of that helped too,
all of
but
that,
not the pills
actually,
most.
The pills get you to a certain point where you can start rebuilding yourself, and you can start working out what actually caused the breakdown in the first place. But if you're not running, if you're not looking after yourself in other ways, then you could be on those pills forever, and they don't have great side effects, I have to say. So,
well, it's brilliant to have you back, Isabel. Brilliant to have both of you back. Thank you very much indeed. We have run out of time, a lot to talk about today, but thank you both very much indeed.
Welcome back. Time now to take a quick look at what's on the front pages this morning. And let's start, shall we, with the Mail on Sunday. It's reporting on battles within the Cabinet, saying there is now all-out war between Boris Johnson and Philip Hammond. How times change. The Sunday Times says that 4 Cabinet ministers, including Johnson and Hammond, plotted to replace Theresa May after the general election result. Let's turn to the Sunday Telegraph, shall we? It says that the Foreign Secretary has demanded assurances that Britain won't adopt any EU rules after it formally leaves in 2019. Here's the Sunday Express. It says that Boris Johnson is claiming credit for saving Brexit by tackling Remainers in the Cabinet who wanted to delay it until 2024. The Observer leads in a letter to Jeremy Corbyn from Labour MPs, urging him to commit to staying in the EU single market permanently. More on that in just a moment. A poll commissioned by the Huffington Post UK finds that London Mayor Sadiq Khan is voters' preferred candidate to replace Jeremy Corbyn when he stands down as Labour leader. And BuzzFeed says that record numbers of people in Britain are opening up their homes to refugees. Well, to talk about all of that, we're joined by Jack Blanchard, editor of Politico's new London Playbook Politics Briefing, the New Statesman special correspondent Stephen Bush, and the former Labour advisor Ayesha Hazarika. Everyone, lovely to see you. A motley crew this early on a Sunday morning. Well, let's start, will we, with that front page story in the Observer. Make Labour the pro-single market party, Jeremy Corbyn is told. It's not going to happen, is it?
No. Jeremy is a Eurosceptic of long-standing vintage. You have a large number of MPs from the Midlands and Yorkshire who really do not want to go against their own voters on the referendum. But it is something which unites basically almost all of the trade unions and a large chunk of Labour MPs in London and the South, particularly those new gains they made on the back of Remain voters in the election.
And there has been, actually, for some time, a little bit of doubt as to exactly what direction the party was taking, in terms of the single market. Varying comments from, let's be fair, Jeremy Corbyn, no, we're coming out, well, we could stay in. At least this would provide a point of divergence with the Conservatives at the moment.
Well, I think they feel that they got themselves into quite a good position on Brexit. A lot of work that Keir Starmer and Emily Thornberry had got to say, look, we're going to have this transition period, we'll remain within the customs union and the single market as we sort of transition our way out. That seemed to be quite a good holding position for the Labour Party because, as Stephen said, you're trying to keep this quite fragile coalition together of, the unions and people. And don't underestimate the difficulty that some Northern Labour MPs find themselves in because their constituents voted to leave. So the holding position they've got to is quite sensible. Everyone's quite comfortable with it. I suspect this is just smart posturing because it's the first day of conference. There is a group of MPs, Chuka Umunna, Alison McGovern, who really, really want us to stay within the single market. So I think this is good. It's a good, stunt from them, but I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
The other reason it's interesting as well is this is the one issue where Jeremy Corbyn has a very different view to his core grassroots supporters who have put him in power and have kept him in power for the last couple of years, there's a real divergence. Most of those grassroots supporters are very pro-EU, they're very pro-single market, and they're a bit uncomfortable about Jeremy Corbyn's inherent Euroscepticism, and so this sort of thing, for the Labour moderates, as they would see themselves, sort of helps to split a little, open up splits a little bit between Corbyn and his supporters.
But if all that it amounts to is a letter written to the Observer, I mean, the split remains, doesn't it? I mean, let's be fair about it. As things stand, 35% of the Labour supporters voted to leave. Anything which looks vaguely like continuing the structures of the European Union after we leave it, that's not going to sit well with them.
Well, I think this is why actually their current position is quite clever, because they basically can say to that third of their vote which voted to leave, we're leaving but we'll have a transition, but then they can basically kind of have a nudge and a wink at the voters who voted to stay in and say, but anything could happen during a 2-year transition. So I think at the moment, parking for a moment the question of whether or not it's best for the country, Labour's position is great for it electorally.
Jack, take us on to political, strangely enough, and party reforms. Lots on the agenda at this party conference. But frankly, the big battles, it looks like, could be taking place over the next 12 months.
That's right, exactly. And this can all seem a bit archaic if you're watching at home, like listening to a party debate its own rule book. Seems a little bit boring and maybe unimportant, but the truth is it's hugely important. The last time Labour rewrote the rule book in 2014, it changed the way leaders were elected, and it led directly to the rise of Jeremy Corbyn. What they're doing now is reviewing this again, and over the next 12 months Jeremy Corbyn's secretary will be looking at what other rule changes they should make. Politico this morning have published some of the proposals that will be going into this review that were leaked to one of my colleagues, and it's pretty radical stuff that they're going to be looking at. They're talking about rewriting Clause 4, the totemic thing that Tony Blair did back in the 90s. There's all sorts of proposals going in there about how leadership rule changes, leaders could be re-elected differently in the future, deputy leaders could be elected differently in the future. It's really big stuff that in the end could, were it to go through, could completely change the direction that Labour goes in the years to come.
And this stuff is really important. The Labour Party is a party steeped in the theology of the rulebook. It is the Bible. And a lot of the kind of historic wars in the Labour Party have not honestly been about the big vision for the country, it's about the internal politics. So you're seeing that sort of opened up again, and the devil is going to be in the detail, but make no mistake, every row that is had over something which seems quite innocuous from the outside could have, as Jack says, huge ramifications for how councillors are selected, obviously how MPs are selected, whether there's mandatory reselection. So some of this stuff is going to have very, very big consequences.
I mean, Stephen, for all the talk that the party is more unified than it's ever been, I mean, all the stuff about changes to the NEC, to nominations for leadership, I mean, that gives the lie to the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is in total command of the party. I mean, if he were in total command of the party, why the need for the rule changes?
Well, actually, I think the rule changes showed that he's in command of the party. Every time a faction in the Labour Party is dominant, they try and rig the score so they can stay dominant forever. Of course, the other amusing tradition in Labour politics is every rule change has not worked out the way that the person bringing in the rule change has thought it would work out for them.
But is Clause 4 still, I mean, if we saw socialism re-injected into it, I mean, obviously totemic for the party itself, do we think the wider world cares?
No, I don't think the wider world cares about clauses and sub-clauses. What the wider world cares about is Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party going to be a credible government in waiting, and would they trust the Labour Party with the economy again? But
the other thing to say as well is, of course, Jeremy Corbyn's not getting any younger. At some point he is not going to be the leader of the Labour Party anymore, and whether the Labour continues on its current trajectory of being a very left-wing party, or whether it moves back towards the sort of Blair field in the future is obviously hugely important.
One point on that which is interesting about the rule change, this John McDonnell amendment to lower the threshold of support that you would need to get on the ballot paper, paradoxically that could actually favour a more right-wing candidate down the track, which ironically could be a sort of minority, a less popular kind of thing. So it could open up the field.
You're saying we're going to be here again in 10 years talking about the other side of the party? Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, look, absolutely, apropos of absolutely nothing to do with clashes between senior figures in politics. Chancellor versus Boris, it's all-out war. Who wants to take off in this? Stephen, are you surprised by this? I mean, there's some interesting detail coming out.
Yeah, I think I am surprised about it, partly because although we know there are these undercurrents of some people who want basically a very close relationship, some who want a very distant relationship with the EU after we leave, and there are also a lot of personal egos at stake, I did sort of think after the week they had that they might at least be able to keep it together for one weekend. I mean, not least because in their mind, if you're a Conservative, what you want is you hope that Labour will have a row at its conference. You don't want to have a row during Labour's conference, and yet here we are at Labour conference talking about Tory split. And it does show that that discipline they used to have, that used to make them an election-winning machine, does seem to have gone away.
Still, that detail that Tim Shipton of the Sunday Times does it again, the detail that Philip Hammond phoned up Boris in the morning of the election, you know, some kind of political booty call, and said, look, I stand ready to help you out.
I don't think I can unsee that image, quite frankly. I know, it's amazing. It makes kind of Game of Thrones look like Call the Midwife in terms of, like, there's so much. But look, they are in real turmoil. It's so interesting, like a year in politics. So last year, Theresa May was going into her conference riding high, solid. She was going to be the Angela Merkel of our time in Britain. You know, the Labour Party was fighting all over the place. A year on, Jeremy Corbyn is incredibly secure, and she is facing it left, right and centre.
Yeah, that's right as well. And it's but it's also interesting to see that, you know, a couple of days after she's made this big Brexit speech, you've got huge Tory splits over Brexit on the front page of the Mail and Labour splits about Brexit on the front page of the Observer. This has been the story of the past year, and it will be the story of the next year as well.
Is that on a loop?
Jack, Aisha, Stephen, thank you all very much for joining us. Pleasure to see you. Enjoy your conference.
Like her, who insisted she was still driving us out of the EU, though our supposed liberation will take at least another 2 years and we'll be in second class with no vote on laws that affect us. The rest of Europe, led by its chief negotiator, seemed pleased that she said after the divorce she so hopes we can still be friends, though they still don't trust us to make the maintenance payments. As for him, he's preparing for government by, well, changing his party's rules, so that if he ever feels like packing it all in for his allotment, his successor won't be one of those annoying Blairites, hi Chuka, who know absolutely nothing about winning elections, do they? Anyway, Allegra, to quote someone we know, nothing has changed.
Nothing has changed. Theresa May gave that speech about Brexit on Friday. It was supposed to settle everything, but this morning you can see that the fighting goes on. On the front page of the Sunday Telegraph, we have Boris Johnson setting out yet more red lines. This is quite an incendiary intervention. Here he is. There's so many red lines, they've had to put these bullet points there. He's unhappy about that 2-year transition period that Theresa May proposed. In particular, he does not want the EU regulations to count in the UK during those 2 years. There's a whole list of them. Now, over here for Remain, you can see on the front of the Observer, there's that story about Colin Firth leaving to become an Italian sister over concerns about Brexit. And then here, our friend Chuka Umunna is among those Labour figures who have written saying that they want Labour to become the party of soft Brexit in essence. So to say that they will stay in the single market in perpetuity. And then down here you have them also calling for Labour's Brexit policy to be debated at conference. Now, the problem is the Labour leadership have the conference schedule in an extremely tight grip. As Private Eye has joked here, they've said that that conference line up in full: Jeremy, Diane, Emily. Jeremy, Diane and Emily. Robert.
Well, I'm delighted to be joined by the Labour MP Chuka Umunna and the former Downing Street insider Katie Perrier, worked for Theresa in Number 10 before that great general election. Chuka, if I could start with you. We had Theresa May's speech in Florence clarifying her approach to Brexit. Do you think that in terms of Labour's revealed policy on Brexit, there's now much of a difference between Labour and the Tories?
Well, with regard to transition, the implementation phase that the Prime Minister refers to, definitely there is clear red water between...
Is that? What is that? What is
between, well, hang on just a minute, between Labour's position and the Tory position, because we're contemplating a transition period of up to 4 years, which it seems to me is practically realistic.
She said around 2 years. She hasn't said religiously 2 years.
Well, she more or less has, and she also refuses to have accept any notion of us staying in the single market and also having a customs union arrangement for that kind of period of time.
Not sure your leaders have yet committed to stay in the single market.
But there's a but. There's a but. At the end of the transition period, we've reserved our position, and what I and many other people across the Labour spectrum would like to see the party do is to go a step further and commit to us wanting and seeking to keep Britain in the single market and the customs union beyond that transition period, because that is the best way to retain the economic benefits that we have now. And it's not just about jobs, by the way. This is a social justice argument as well, because it keeps us within that framework of rules on consumer protection, workers' rights and environment.
Sure, we're going to talk about this a lot more later in the programme. Katie, you used to work for Boris. You're close to him. I had this extraordinary thing when I was in New York with the Prime Minister. We were supposed to be there talking about world problems. All we were talking about was the tension between Boris and the Prime Minister. Boris is claiming that his Brexit stand in the Telegraph a week ago has yielded victories for his Brexiteering side of the argument. Is he right? Has he pushed the Prime Minister away from longer transition, away from the so-called Norway model post-Brexit?
To a certain extent, yes, I think so. I think that he has made his point clear. Don't forget.
But do you think she shifted her position at all?
No, I think that she probably went with that idea, but firmed it. Yeah, absolutely. Got that speech a little bit tighter as a result of what Boris Johnson was asking for, and continues to flex his muscles. He carries that Brexit vote on his shoulders, and he wants to make sure it's a successful Brexit. But of course, what a successful Brexit is, it means very different things to people across the House of Commons.
Put simply, lots of people think he is shown to be weaker post this row. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't, actually. And I think that, I also think Theresa May looks stronger as a result.
They both look stronger. That can't be true. They can't both be stronger, Katie. One of them must have won, one of them must have lost.
Not at all. I think that actually across the last fortnight, what we've seen is that Theresa May, if she was weaker, then she wouldn't be ahead in the polls right now, or certainly neck and neck.
But wouldn't she have sacked him if she was? If this was gross disloyalty.
There was a poll out.
If she was
a poll. Most of the money were ahead.
If the Labour Party was going really ahead in the way that they're claiming, we've had some debates this weekend in the bars already. Did they win? No, they didn't win the election. But the point is that they're not as far ahead as people think, because they're neck and neck ahead in the polls. And also, I've not heard from the Labour Party at all about any kind of payment deal. How much money? I'd hope to hear from the Shadow Chancellor soon, Robert. How much money is he prepared to pay?
I'm going to straight question. Okay, this was, many would say, the greatest act of disloyalty by a serving cabinet minister that any of us have seen in terms of what Boris did. She didn't sack him. Surely that makes her look weaker.
I think it's really difficult, because we're in a position right now where if she was challenged, I think she's in a put up or shut up moment. Either get on with it, get behind me, let's do the best Brexit deal. And if I was in number 10 at that time when Boris had done that, I probably would have made a pretty strong phone call.
So what are the big political stories this Sunday morning? Well, Jeremy Corbyn kicked off conference with a rally of the party faithful here last night in scenes that looked more like a festival than a political event. And he said the transformation of Labour under his leadership was just starting, and that the party would be ready whenever the next election is called. More than 30 Labour MPs and others in the party have signed a letter calling on Mr Corbyn to commit to permanent full membership of the single market and the customs union after Brexit. The Shadow Home Secretary Diane Abbott will be addressing conference this morning, and she'll accuse the Conservatives of weaponising immigration. The Tories call that a slur and say they're responding to widespread concern about the subject. And speaking of the Conservatives, the Brexit Secretary David Davis has said claims of a £40 billion divorce bill as a result of leaving the EU are made up. And of course, as usual, the papers are full of claims about the continuing turmoil within the cabinet over Brexit. And then there's this woman who could have a very big say over our post-EU future. Angela Merkel is tipped to retain power in the German elections today after already serving 12 years in office. But this is the Labour Party conference after all, so let's begin by talking about Jeremy Corbyn. He's given the traditional Leaders' TV interview at the start of his party gathering, and he was asked repeatedly whether he would support strike action, even if it doesn't meet the necessary turnout threshold set out in new legislation.
If Len McCluskey is on the picket line on a strike the government has declared to be illegal, are you with him or are you against him?
Listen, I'll be with those workers demanding a decent pay rise.
Even if they've gone on strike against the 50%
I will be with them demanding a decent pay rise.
So you will be on those picket lines?
I'll be with them demanding a decent pay rise.
That's as near as we're going to get.
Tom Newton-Dunn, we'll start with you. I mean, the Jeremy Corbyn that we saw in the Andrew Marr show, sat exactly where you are, funnily enough, was much more like the traditional politician that you see on these kind of shows, deftly or not avoiding the question. Is this a new Corbyn that we've got who can't commit to things like joining a picket line?
I think it's quite a purposeful new Corbyn, yes, and Andrew Marr eventually got incredibly frustrated at the end of the interview and finally said, what's happened to the Jeremy Corbyn I used to love? He'd give me a straight answer. And Jeremy Corbyn went on to say, I'd become leader of the Labour Party, and then explain why. But there is indeed the problem. Nick Clegg this morning described, because of course it's not just strikes that Corbyn hasn't been pinned down on. You know, it's the vast array of questions questions on Brexit, public sector pay, huge amounts of other things. Nick Clegg described Labour's positioning on Brexit as constipated ambivalence, which is an interesting phrase, but it does sum up the positioning, particularly on Brexit, where they want to be at the moment, which is do not get themselves pinned down, allow the Tories to have this giant scrap, then Labour can come in afterwards claiming they had all the answers in the first place.
Paul Mason, you often write things more sympathetic towards the Corbyn leadership.
Always.
Are you sympathetic on his position on this?
Well, his position is he wants to be Prime Minister. But the position of the Labour movement, the Unite delegations, the GMB delegations in there, and people like me, I've been on strike in 3 unions. We want to get rid of these anti-strike laws, and insofar as workers defy them, I've got no problem. We defy them. We're there on the picket line with them. It's just if you want to be Prime Minister, you have to show a little bit more gravitas and let the rank and file and this mass movement that outside. I mean, I think you'll see this week, this is a very changed Labour Party. It's full of enthusiastic young people. If anybody does go on strike, defying the Tory laws, good luck to them, and 90% of the people in this conference will be with them, I would have thought.
And Helen Lewis, I mean, as Paul describes, there is a very changed feel to conference here, and the rally we saw last night had the whiff of a victory rally about it, even though Labour didn't actually win the election. Is there a danger of complacency here, that the membership here are convinced that they're ready to win the next election without making any changes?
There is, absolutely, because both parties are split on Brexit, and the particular danger of Brexit for Jeremy Corbyn is that he's split from his membership. That's why we're seeing unfolding today this row about whether or not there will be a motion that we voted on about Brexit at conference. Now, that is being pushed by people like the TSSA, that is a left-wing union with a head who is Corbynite, right? So it is not a kind of Blairite plot in any sense. But I think Paul's right that, you know, the thing that's really different from 2 years ago when we were here at Labour Party conference is the confidence of Jeremy Corbyn. So look at the difference between Ed Miliband answering a question about whether or not he supported strikes, and he ummed and he ahed and he felt caught out. Corbyn kind of magisterially swept past that question, and I think that's really the thing that has changed, is that he can, at the moment, he's in so much pomp that he can get away with that.
Of course, it's not only the Labour Party that have their own internal splits about Brexit. As we know, the Tories are fighting their own civil war about this. If you have a look at what was in the Sunday Times this morning, we see that there are reports of a plot to actually try and topple Theresa May after the general election. That's referring to something that happened a few months ago, but it does show us just quite how disunited the Cabinet are, doesn't it, Tom?
Completely, and although things have changed a little bit since then, I think the story this morning is about Philip Hammond telling Boris Johnson he'd back him at 4 a.m. on election morning once the Tory disaster had become clear. That's because Philip Hammond thought he was going to get sacked. He was convinced that Theresa May wanted to sack him, so he wanted to saddle himself to another horse. But, you know, we move on. We're now after, you know, the post-Florence speech, and the cabinet divisions are still there. That is because the Florence speech didn't really solve any of the problems. It really kicked the problems down the road by a couple of years.
And Helen, I mean, do you think that the Florence speech in any way united the Cabinet? They said they were united around that position on the transition, but there's a lot of battles to be fought over this yet.
I think they're united over the fact that none of them can decide who should be the leader instead, and that is the kind of fragile unity that holds the Tory party together, right? You always think of it like a shark. It is kind of predatory and it always keeps moving. And I'm not surprised to see that text in the morning. It wouldn't be the Tory party that we know if they hadn't been getting ready to topple a leader who had failed essentially to win a majority. But until the point when we get somebody else who they feel, you know, everyone can unite behind, she's in place.
So briefly, Paul, does that mean that the hopes that we hear from delegates here that there will be a general election really quite soon, that's fanciful?
I think it puts it further away, but I also think May's move on Thursday opens up some, as it were, softer Brexit ground for Corbyn, because every ratchet towards soft Brexit that May takes opens up the opportunity for Corbyn to address that 48%, which ultimately did contribute to Labour's rise in the actual vote in June 2017.
Okay, guys, thanks for that.